Everyone, it's time for our keynote speaker. Before I give you his formal introduction, I want to fill you in that actually I realized, when they announced who the speakers were going to be, I started watching videos of this individual, and I thought, wow, this guy's amazing. I can't wait to hear him speak. And then I looked at some of the books that he had written, that he's wrote, whatever. And I remember when I was in high school, actually, I was dating this girl, and I read one of his books, and it's Crossing the Tiber, the transition into becoming Catholic, and my girlfriend at the time was Baptist, and I thought, wow, this book is going to be like my user guide to get her to convert. That didn't work out, but it was still a great book. Stephen Ray was raised in a devout, loving Baptist family. His father was a deacon and a Bible teacher, and Stephen was very involved in the Baptist church as a teacher of biblical studies and lectured on a wide range of topics. Steve and his wife, Janet, entered the Catholic Church in 1994. Steve is the author of 3 best-selling Ignatius Press books and speaks at conferences all around the world. Steve is also a regular guest on The Journey Home and has appeared on many other radio and TV programs, including Fox News. He is the writer, producer, and host of the 10-part video DVD series, The Footprints of God, the story of salvation from Abraham to Augustine, filmed entirely on location in the Holy Land and surrounding countries. Isn't that cool? That's so cool. Steve and his wife, Janet, are certified guides to the Holy Land and lead pilgrimages throughout the Middle East and Rome. He and Janet live in Michigan and have 4 children and many, many grandchildren. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Steve Ray.
Thank you very much. Of all the things that you listed, the thing I'm proudest of is I've been married to the same woman for 43 years, and I love her more now than when I married her. 4 kids. 4 kids that survived college and are great Catholics to this day, and 17 grandkids, 2 boys who are already thinking of being priests. That's what I'm the proudest of. So I'm going to leave my hat on because if I take it off, you won't recognize me. And if I take it off also, the glare, I don't know if you'd be able to look, so I'll keep it on. Anyway, I only have 30 minutes, and it normally takes me an hour to do this talk, so I'm going to get right into it, and I'm going to talk a little faster than I normally do, so if you bear with me. This whole talk is called Swimming Upstream, How to Live a Catholic Life in a Pagan World. And it all started when my parents, before my father died 6 years ago, he was 94. My mother is 98 today, and they were married 73 years. They were a very good example for me of how to be a family and parents and Christians. So they were Baptists, they never converted, but I have nothing but love for the way they raised me, to love Jesus and the Bible, and to eventually find the Catholic Church. My dad said to me one time, he said, "Steve, I don't recognize my country anymore, and I'm not happy with it." I said, "Dad, tell me what you mean by that." I knew he was getting old, and I wouldn't have him around long. And I said, "What do you mean by that, Dad, that you're not recognize your country anymore?" He says, "Well, Steve, when we got married way back at the first part of the last century," he said, the world was a different place. The United States was a Christian nation. It doesn't mean that everybody carried a Bible around and quoted John 3:16, but we all held a basic Christian morality, and we all believed the Bible, and we would never hesitate to say we were Christian. No one would ever be upset with us for being Christians. And he said, but things have changed. He said, if someone had asked us after we were married and started our family if we ever would consider getting an abortion, our first response would have been, "What's an abortion?" He said, we had no idea what that was. We'd never heard of such a thing. Nobody would have, even if maybe there were some in the background somewhere, nobody in polite public would ever discuss it. In fact, nobody even knew what it meant. He said, and now in our country, it's acceptable, even lauded, and I'm supposed to not just accept it, I'm supposed to celebrate it, and then I find out that my tax dollars are being spent to pay for abortions. And there's all of these things going on in our country. He said that back in those days, there may have been some homosexuality and all of these things, but we never talked about it in polite public. It was never something you discussed. And then all of a sudden I find out that now it's being acceptable, almost something to be proud of. And you put a rainbow flag out in front of your house, and then the Supreme Court says that what two men getting married is equal to what your mother and I did when we got married and had a family. And we just don't understand this anymore. And we don't really understand our country, and we don't really like what it's going to nowadays. And I had to stop and think about that for a minute, because our country has changed. The whole world has changed that way. Western world has changed very rapidly that way in the last decades. And I realized that there was a timeline here. Something was going on. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, they lived in a pagan, Greco-Roman world. And then for during that 300 years, they converted the world upside down for Jesus Christ. We'll talk about that. That's the theme of my talk. And then we had all the blessings of Christianity because of that in the Western world. The universities, hospitals, and medicine, the equality of women, all of these things and many more came from the beauty and the teaching of Christianity. I know the world today likes to say, well, the Catholic Church hates women, hates science, hates... No, that's not true. If you study it objectively, you'll find that Christianity and the Catholic Church is what gave birth to all of those wonderful things. And then about 100 years ago, our whole Western world started to go right back into paganism again. Not because paganism proved to be better than Christianity, not because a better philosophy has been presented and proven that we're wrong. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Christianity is superior, and I don't mind being politically incorrect to say that. The world wants me to say that Christianity is just one of many different equal ideas, and I won't say that. I've studied them all, and I'm thoroughly convinced that Christianity and the Catholic Church are superior to the other philosophies and cultures and other ideas that oppose what we believe. And so we started to fall back into that very similar type of paganism. Back in the old days, they had many gods. When the Christians were in Rome and in the Roman Empire, there were many gods. Aphrodite, Zeus, Apollo, all of these gods. And the pantheon was there in the center of Rome. And there at the top was all these niches and all the gods. There's Apollo. There's Aphrodite. There's Artemis. The more gods, the better. And they were all there. And today, we are going back into the same kind of an idea, except we don't call it polytheism anymore. We call it pluralism. And not that we disparage other cultures or languages or peoples, but that whole idea today of pluralism means that you and I have to accept everything as being equally valid. We have to accept every philosophy, every religion, atheism, agnosticism, and everything else as equally valid. And if you don't, then you're a bigot. And for Christians to say that they have the truth, that the Word of God is true, and the Catholic Church teaches true doctrine, that makes you a bigot. That makes you somebody who is intolerant of all these other people. And that's not the case. We are, I think, the most tolerant of all people, but we know what's true because it's been revealed to us in Scripture and in tradition and in the church. The world today is becoming very hostile to Christianity. I don't know if you've recognized that or not lately, but I find it all the time. How many of you feel free to just go out and tell people anywhere you are that you're a Catholic and that you believe it's true? Most of us have gotten to the point where we're pretty quiet about our belief and our faith in the common world and in the public. We aren't quite easygoing to say what we believe anymore. We're hesitant to do that because the world is telling us that you are not accepted. Christianity and your ideas are okay in 3 places. You are okay to be a Christian and teach these things in your own head, in your own homes, and in your churches. But when you come out of those 3, you Catholics, shut up. Keep your Christianity out of the marketplace. Keep your religion out of politics. And don't be trying to push your morality on the rest of us. It's okay, of course, if they push their immorality on us and their worldviews. They are the most tolerant of all, aren't they? And yet those who claim to be the most tolerant, I find to be the most intolerant. And it's more and more coming. Now, I don't know if here in Fargo it's different, but in every other place I go to, It's very much hostile to Christianity. And you know that hostility has not just happened. It's only in the recent past that's been happening, because my parents don't remember that ever being there. They remember it now as something that's coming and opposing us. Now, the early Christians were raised in a pagan culture. They had many gods. They had great immorality. Roman men usually had a legal wife to have legal children, a concubine to have other children, and a mistress for pleasure on the side. They did all kinds of immorality. They had abortion. Crudely practiced, but it was there because the early Christians condemned it from the very beginning. They allowed babies to die. They did all kinds of immoral things. And those early Christians, they stood up to it, and they were different. And within 300 years, think about it, these simple Christians turned the whole Roman Empire upside down for Jesus Christ. And in 313, Christianity was legalized, and shortly thereafter, it became the religion of the empire. There's a lot of documents being written about the new evangelization. Documents coming out of Rome, and bishops, my own bishop, wrote a very good document on the new evangelization. But I gave this talk one time at a men's conference with my bishop there, and I told him, I says, Bishop, you know, it's really not necessary. It's a good document, but it's really not necessary. All of the documents that have come out of the synods and out of the Vatican, and all this, how many of you have read all those on the new evangelization? That's what I thought. Why do I say that they're really unnecessary? Because the very first Christians already gave us a blueprint for converting a pagan, hostile world. For 300 years, they practiced this blueprint, and it worked. It was utterly successful. And I'm saying that we don't need to develop and invent anything new. Let's just go back and look at what the early Christians came up with, and let's see how they did it, because we know it worked. So I want to just say, who were these early Christians that were able to convert the empire? And what was their blueprint? That's what we're going to talk about now. The early Christians, Paul tells us who they were. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Consider your call, brethren. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were noble birth. But God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. God didn't start out to bring Christianity and to change the world with the noble, the rich, and the wise. He started it with people like us. Simple people who really, really believed. They really, really believed it was true. In fact, they believed it was so true, it was not only worth living for, it was worth dying for. And that's what the early Christians did. Now, how did they propagate the gospel? How did they get this all started? Well, first of all, they couldn't have churches. For the first 320 years, you couldn't build churches. It was not a legal religion. They met in homes. Dominus ecclesia, Dominus home, ecclesia church. Somebody among the Christians, the small gathering of Christians, would say, I have a villa outside of town. On Sunday morning, all of you can come. We'll have the holy sacrifice of the Mass at my house. But don't all come at once. We need 5 or 10 of you to come from this direction. A couple minutes later, we don't want to raise anybody's suspicion that something's going on here. And they didn't have churches. Made it more difficult to practice the faith. They couldn't do door-to-door evangelism. They couldn't have World Youth Day or open-air crusades where they preached and they taught. They couldn't do that. And you couldn't go to the emperor's palace and picket him if you didn't like his policies. So how did the Christians do this? Well, they did have masses, private and quiet, but they were accused of cannibalism because they were rumored to eat flesh and drink blood in their meetings. They were also incestuous. There's many documents where the early pagans who accused them of being incestuous because families came together and loved one another, and they had a kiss that they did during their service. And they were atheists because the Romans worshipped statues and idols, but when you went to the Christian services, there was no God. There's nothing to see up there. What are they worshiping? They're atheists. They have no gods. So how did they proclaim the truth? Well, one of the ways is that they talk to people. You had to be careful how you talk to people back then about Jesus Christ, just like it's getting to be today. You know, you can't just talk about Jesus Christ around the world. If you're in a Muslim country, this is not acceptable. There's surveys out. The most dangerous place for Christians to live today are in Muslim countries where it's illegal. North Korea and China. You can't talk about Jesus in those places. They're all around the world, it's becoming more and more hostile. And in the Western world, it's becoming more and more hostile for us too. I fear for my grandchildren. This is why one of the beautiful things about what you're doing here tonight is you're building a place where we can educate and where they can feel safe and where they can learn the faith and they can be together and they can bond and they can grow together even in the midst of a hostile world. They have their own kind of underground club in the Newman Center. You have to think of it that way today because we are becoming a despised subculture. Therefore, in many ways, we're going underground. We're not going to cave into the world. I love the t-shirts. I saw them. Do not be conformed to the world, it says on the back. Well, if you're not going to be conformed to the world, you're going to be opposed to the world. And if you're opposed to the world, you better find like-minded souls to gather together so that you can be a band or a club together, an underground movement almost. That's what Christianity is going to become more when my grandchildren and great-grandchildren are around. I don't know. It's moving awful fast. How did they talk about Jesus? Let me give you an example. If I go to the bus stop and I see a man there and I walk up to him and I say, "Sir, how are your kidneys today?" What's he going to say? "My kidneys are none of your business, you pervert. Get away from me." My kidneys. Now, let's say a year later, I have now gone over and helped that man because I find out he does have a medical problem. And when he's in the hospital, we bring food to his family. We give him gifts at Christmas. We help them with all the problems that they're having. And a year later, I meet the very same man at the very same bus stop. And I say, "Good morning, sir. How are your kidneys today?" What's the response going to be? He's going to say, "Well, thank you so much. My kidneys are doing much better. I got out of the hospital last week." Look at the difference in response. One, he thinks, "Get away from me," and another one is, "Thank you for asking me about my kidneys." What's the difference? I built a relationship with that man, and I earned the right to talk to him about something important to me. As a Protestant, I used to teach classes on evangelization. One of the classes I taught was how to convert Catholics, believe it or not. And we learned that you evangelize, it's called relational evangelism. You evangelize by building relationships with people and earning the right to speak to them. By the way, I bet you all have many of those relationships, and I wonder how well you use them to talk about what's important to you, Jesus Christ and his church. They did talk about the resurrection. They also lived disciplined lives. They stood out among the Romans because they lived disciplined lives. Morals. Paul taught morals as he traveled around the Roman Empire. I'm taking a cruise next year. We're going to go to all the Pauline sites through the Mediterranean and all the places I talk about this. Paul confronted paganism and immorality and sin, and he told them about Jesus Christ. But they lived that disciplined moral life. They also cared for the poor and disadvantaged because the Christians had the Judeo-Christian philosophy had a very different view than the Romans. The Greco-Roman world used people as utilitarian. They used people, they viewed them as something to be used for my profit, for my good. But the Christians said that every single person, even the unborn, even from the moment of conception until the moment of natural death, was a human being which was made in the image of God, that at the very moment of conception, they were infused with the soul. The very life of God was placed in them, a soul, and they were made in God's image. Therefore, they had infinite, eternal value. No matter whether they were crippled or whether they were sick or whatever their situation, they were an person made in the image of God and therefore had infinite value. What saint in the last generation gave us evidence of that other than Mother Teresa in such a profound way? And they treated people differently. And they viewed themselves differently because they were going to live forever in the presence of God or in hell. And therefore, they viewed humanity very different than the Greco-Romans did. There's a letter that was written by a man from Alexandria, Egypt. We still have the letter that he wrote. And he was writing to his wife back in Rome. He had gone to Alexandria, Egypt to work. And he said, as soon as I receive my wages, I will send them to you. In the meantime, if by good fortune you give birth, if it's a boy, let him live. If it's a girl, expose her. Expose her? What does that mean? They didn't have abortion like they do in our country. If they didn't want a child, especially if it was a girl, and you know that even now, pre-birth checking can determine, and many abortions are caused because it's a girl and not a boy. In the rest of the world, it's as common as can be. In China and India, this is a very common practice, but it's becoming common in America too. Illegal, supposedly, but happening. So if it's a boy, let him live. And if it's a girl, expose it. What do they mean, expose it? There's another letter that we have. This is a quote I found. When the Romans threw their unwanted newborn babies under the bridges of Rome, leaving the infants to be carried away by the wild dogs at night, the Christians waited in the shadows, took those infants home, and raised them as their own. And over a short period of time, they won the hearts of many in Rome. They did not accept the utilitarian view of the human being. They said that we are human persons made in the image of God. And they not only opposed all forms of abortion and contraception and any kind of euthanasia, but they went out and they found the babies that the Romans discarded under the bridge, the girls that they were going to expose. And before the dogs could get them at night, the Christians took them home and raised them. We think that's terrible. There are many times in history where we have had gods that required human blood. The Aztecs are only 500 years away and only just to the south of us. And when they dedicated their temple to the god, I can't say his name in their language. It's way too complicated. But in English it means the lover of hearts, the drinker of blood. Their god was called the lover of hearts, physical hearts, and the drinker of blood. And when they dedicated the temple near Mexico City today, in Mexico City, only 500 years ago, in their own documents, they claimed they sacrificed 80,600 human beings to dedicate that temple. They would take them to the top of the temple, cut open their chest, rip open their heart, and they would hold it up dripping to the gods. And by the time they were done, the blood was just flowing down onto the ground from these huge altars that they had built, really high temples. And then they would be cannibals and they would eat the bodies. There were in biblical times these kind of gods. They've been around in past history for a long time. I'll just tell you one quickly about Moloch. He was a god that was in biblical times, and even many times the Israelites took them down into the Gehenna Valley, and they passed their children through the fire to these gods. Solomon himself did this. He worshipped these gods. One was called Moloch, and in my movie on Elijah and Elisha, I go into great detail. Moloch was a big cast iron god. He was made out of cast iron with a big head with holes in his eyes, a big hole in his belly, and his hands and arms were like this out of cast iron. And they would call, once a year, they would have a big festival to Moloch because he was the fertility god. And they had to pray to him because he wanted human sacrifice. And if they gave him the human sacrifice, then he would give them rains and he would give them good crops. So what would happen is, say, on the feast day of Moloch, they would come together, the whole province, and the priest would pick out several families who had newborn babies. You, and you. We have chosen you to be the great heroes of our province because you are going to get to offer your children to Moloch, and you will become heroes because you will be giving your blessing to all of the province and for the prophets next year. And so they would bring the babies, and there would be the horns playing, and the dancing and the bongos, and it would be like an orgy going on because it's all about sexuality, fertility, and they're dancing in front of Moloch, and they bring their infants, and the priest lays the infants on the hands of Moloch, which are already hits him like a steak hitting a grill, and they push the baby down. He rolls down the arms into the belly of Moloch. And you don't even hear the screams of the baby because of the dancing and the music and the drums. And then the priest steps up and said, oh, God, Moloch, we pray now that we've given you our best, that you will give us your best. Make the rains come. Make our farms go well. Give us a profit this year and make us prosperous. Isn't that disgusting? And yet you realize in the United States we still worship the god Moloch, except we've changed his name. His name is now abortion. And Americans, even enshrined in our law, sacrifice their infants for their own prosperity, for their own ease of mind, to save money and not have the inconvenience of a child. For their own prosperity and pleasure, they're willing to sacrifice human beings. And we in the United States, if you don't think we're going back to paganism, we look at the past where they offered sacrifices, and we're doing the same thing in our country today, sanctioned by the law. This is why I'm so proud of Catholics, because you have never given in to that, and you're counter-cultural, and God bless you for it. It's one of the things that made me want to become one of you 25 years ago when I was a Baptist. Many died for the faith in the early centuries. Jesus said, you will be my witnesses. Do you know what the Greek word is for witnesses in the New Testament? You shall be my martus. What word do you think we get from martus? Martyr. The Catechism says some of us will be witnesses with our lips, and some of us will be witnesses with our blood. The early Christians knew this, and many of them died. When I got the chance to talk to seminarians, and sometimes when I'm in India and the Philippines, I talk to 250, 300 seminarians at a time. The seminaries are packed in those countries. And I tell them, I hope that you're courageous, because the world is not going to be friendly to you when you become a priest. If you are becoming a priest for a career, then get out of here now. This is not a career. It's a love affair with the bride of Christ. And if that's not your purpose for being here, then go now. And I hope that you're courageous men, because we don't need cowards, because it's going to be very difficult. And when the bishop puts the oil on your forehead to ordain you a priest, he's also going to be painting a bullseye on your chest. If you want to be a priest, you have to be a courageous man in the coming years. And every one of those young men to a man stood and said, we're going nowhere. We're going to be priests. The first 30 popes died as martyrs. They knew when they took the chair of Peter, they had a bullseye on their chest. And they died as martyrs, knowing that when they took the chair, and yet they did because they believed it was true enough to die for it. Tertullian was one of the church fathers, and he said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What does he mean by that? They were taking the Christians into the arenas, and the word arena in Latin means sand. They would have white sand in the arena, and they would bring them in, and they would kill them, and their blood would hit the sand, and it would, and the crowds of people would just go crazy and frenzied. Kill more, kill more. It's one of the things, like, go to the movies today, our young people, the kind of movies they watch. And they'd go to these great arenas, and they would see the Christians killed, and they'd kill more, kill more. And Tertullian said, the more you kill us, when one drop of blood hits that sand, 10 more of us will grow up from the seed you just planted. Augustine explained it this way. The earth has been filled with the blood of martyrs as with seed. And from the seed have sprung up the crops of the church. The martyrs have preached Christ's cause more effectively when dead than when alive. They assert it today. They preach him today, but their tongues are silent, yet their deeds echo around the world. They were arrested, bound, in prison, brought to trial, tortured, burned at the stake, stoned to death, run through with swords, fed to wild beasts. And in all kinds of death they were jeered as worthless Christians. But precious in the sight of the Lord are the death of his saints. These early Christians, when they died, the blood hit the sand, and it was a seed. Justin Martyr was one of the first early Christians. He's in my movie on the Apostolic Fathers because he was so early on. And he became a Christian, he said, because he watched the Christians die. He said, how can they die that way? We Romans die very poorly. We curse and we swear and we condemn. But the Christians, look at them out there when they die. They care for one another. They sing hymns to their God, and they go with a peace of mind that we would never have. How can they do that? What do the Christians have that we don't have? The Romans knew their gods were mythical. They knew they didn't have anything substantial to build a society on because their gods were mythical. People live like their gods. Their gods were immoral. But the Christians had one God, not many. They lived a moral life because that's the way their God was, and people live like their gods. Justin Martyr says, they must have something I don't have, and he studied Christianity, and he said he was a philosopher. He wore the philosopher's pallium, and he said, I now am a Christian because they have the true philosophy. And they called him in after a while in Rome. You are preaching this. Do you think that you will die and go to heaven? And he says, I don't think so, I know so. Are you one of those Christians? I am certainly a Christian. You have to deny you're a Christian, or I will whip you and have your head cut off. Do what you will. I have done nothing wrong. I am a Christian. And he would not back down. And they took him and they whipped him and they cut his head off. That's how he got his name, Justin Martyr. Then they called all of his students, and we still have their names. And the trial transcripts of what happened. And they brought all of them in. And they said, you have to deny your Christ. And all of them said to a man, we will not deny our Christ. That we will not be conformed to this world. And we know if you kill us, we'll go to heaven. We don't think it, we know it. And they were all beheaded too. This is what happened to the early Christians. If the early Christians had not been willing to stand strong, none of you would be here today, because Christianity would never have survived. They were the hinge figures between the apostles and the developing church. Had they all caved in, it's like they say, if you cut the head off the snake, you kill the whole snake. And Romans said, if you can kill those leaders, we'll cut the head off the snake. All the other Christians will die out. But it wasn't that way. The more they killed the Christians, the more people converted into the church, because they saw the Christians had something they didn't have. And they wanted that. I'll give you an idea really quickly about what it might have been like in those early days of Christianity, and I want you to experience maybe even just a touch of what it was like. Imagine that I say to you, my name is Emperor Lucian, and I am now a Roman centurion, and you have to go back 1,800 years and use your imagination. And I tell you that I am here tonight with my big red brush on my silver helmet. My sword is drawn, and I have Roman soldiers. Now, you didn't see them when you came in, did you? But I have them now stationed at all the exits, and no one's leaving this room until we take care of a problem. You see, in this province, in this city, there has been a plague. We've had no rains. The crops are suffering. And we, as the military and the government, tried to figure out what the problem was, and we realized what it was. A bunch of you failed to show up to the Zeus festival this year. You know, Zeus is the god of all the gods. He is the king of all the gods. And you have to give him allegiance, and you have to worship him. Otherwise, he will punish us. And why is our city being punished? Because a bunch of you failed to come to the Zeus festival. And I have heard that you are all calling yourselves now Christians. Is that true? Oh, we're going to fix that now. And I have my soldiers here. No one leaves the room. We're going to set up an altar here to Zeus. And all of you are going to come up and pay tribute to Zeus. You are going to worship him. And the way you do it is very simple. Here's a beautiful statue of Zeus, and there is a fire here. And you just take some of the incense and you pinch it and you drop it into the fire. And you worship Zeus. And if you do this, I will give you a libellum. My secretary here, well, you know what a libellum is? It's a certificate that you were a Roman in good standing. And if you leave tonight after worshiping Zeus, you can go home and your family will still be there. Your house will still be there. And your job will still be there Monday morning. However, if you refuse to do that, it's another story. Now, we're going to all do this kind of like you do with your Eucharistia thing. You know, you're all going to get up and come up, start in the front. You can move your way up. We're going to have this altar here. We're going to get the fire going. Okay, let's go. You can cross your fingers if you want to. It's the formality of the thing that counts. Maybe a couple of you would get up and start coming and say, look, I I've got to be responsible. I can't be losing my family or anything. I don't want to be in bad situation with the Romans. I got a business to run. I got contracts. I got to make this. I can't be risking things here. So maybe a few will come up, and then the good bishop here would maybe stand up and say, "Wait a minute. Are you sure you want to go up and worship the pagan gods? Do you remember Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father in heaven? And what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Are you sure you want to do that?" And you sheepishly go back and sit down. And now I, Lucian the centurion, say, "I see that you're going to be stubborn about this, like the group was last week in Ephesus. I know how to deal with you folks. Brutus, come in here." And in from the back comes a 250-pound executioner with tattoos all over his body and a ring in his nose. And he's got a big chopping block. And he comes over and he drops it down on this side of the front. He drops it down and he pulls his sword. Hurrah! And now I, Lucian the centurion, say, you all have 5 minutes to decide which line you're going to get into. No one leaves this room tonight until you get into this line or you get into this line and meet Brutus. Ask yourself an honest question. If you were the early Christians and this happened to you, which did happen to them, which line would you get into tonight? And this is what the early Christians went through. And because they did, they conquered paganism. They turned the Roman Empire upside down for Jesus Christ. And they saved their souls. If we don't love the faith and believe it as much as they did, if we're not willing to sacrifice everything as much as they were, we will never convert the world. It was the genuine faith enough to believe it, enough to even die for it. I tell my kids in front of my grandchildren, I want you to raise my grandchildren to be martyrs. I want them to be prepared for anything and to know the situation. And little Maria Faustina says, "But Grandpa, why do you want us all to die?" I said, "Maria Faustina, I don't want you to die. But I want you to know there's something worth dying for, and that's Jesus Christ and his church. I'm a very selfish grandfather. Because I am going to do my best. I am intending to get to heaven. And I'm very selfish because I want all of you to be there with me." This was the story of the early Christians and what they had to suffer and what they had to go through so that they could share the gospel and spread the gospel around the world and bring a whole pagan culture to be Christianized. And now that our culture is going back towards paganism, what are we going to do? Are we going to go on with life as normal? Are we going to keep our mouths shut when we're out in society? Are we just going to go along and act like we're good Americans going with the flow? You cannot be a good American and just go with the flow anymore. You could during my parents' day, but I don't think you can be a Catholic in good standing today and just go along with the flow of the culture, accepting what it's trying to push down our throats. I think we have to realize we're becoming a despised subculture and wear that badge bravely and honorably and do what the early Christians did and stand up for Jesus Christ, not just in our churches and in our homes and at banquets, but also in the public square and in the marketplace and in politics. We have to influence the world. Jesus said, "You're the salt. If you don't flavor and salt, then you're worthless to be thrown out in the road." I want to just end with 3 quick stories because I know my time is up. First one is we have to impact our young people, and that's exactly what you're doing here tonight. You are working to save young people. We know, like Father said, the majority of the young people lose their faith in colleges. That's why it's so wonderful to see something like you're doing here, because you are bringing them in, giving them a place where they can be Christians together and where they can then go out courageously because I'm not the only one. If they think they're the only one, they go off to a secular school somewhere and they're the only one and there's no club, there's no society, there's no culture together, then they will lose their faith. But if they know that 2 or 3 of them are in the science class together and afterwards they argue with the teacher instead of just accepting what he says. They argue the fact that I did not crawl up out of the muck. God created me in his image. And it takes a whole lot more faith to believe the atheist view than it does the Christian view. And you get these kids all together, then they can share this and they can learn to defend the faith together and they can be proud of what they are. And one of the experiences I had with a young man, and I had opportunity, we heard earlier you didn't like confirmation. I was asked to be a confirmation sponsor for a young man who had just become Catholic. They were a very anti-Catholic family. After we converted, we worked with them for a year, and the family came into the church. The first 2 years, by the way, that we were Catholics, we had people to our homes every Sunday afternoon. We didn't invite anybody. People just heard about it and said, we want to come to your house and talk. Some of them wanted to argue with us about being Catholic. They came and intended to get me out of the Catholic Church. But over a period of 2 years, we watched 200 people come into the Catholic Church just because we were willing to listen to them and talk to them and explain it to them. Now, this family said, would you be our boy's sponsor for confirmation? And I said, no, I can't. I travel way too much. I couldn't do the boy justice. They said, well, would you do us a favor and just meet with him for one night? Anybody that knows me knows you don't ever ask me to do that. I'm not normal like other people are. I said, sure, I will do it. And I knew that I had to make that evening very memorable for this boy. So I had just finished my movie on the Apostolic Fathers and King David, and I had bought a Roman helmet with a big red brush on it. And I had bought a big sword. This is not a play sword. This is a real sword. It's not the kind that the Knights of Columbus use. This is the kind that when if I swung this thing, I'd cut a head off without even trying. Double-edged, sharp sword. It's heavy. So I put that helmet on when I knew he was coming over Wednesday night. And I put the sword in the scabbard in my belt. And my wife pinned a red blanket over my shoulder. And I looked just like a Roman centurion. And I waited in the shadows of my front porch for that kid to get there. When the car drove up, I saw him come up the stairs, like, oh, I got to go talk to this bald-headed guy. Well, I could see it in his eyes. As soon as he got to the top of my steps, I jumped out of the shadows. I pulled the sword, and I pushed the kid against the brick wall, and I said, Matthew, are you ready to die for Jesus Christ right now? Because if not, I'm a busy man. Don't waste my time. Being confirmed is serious business, Matthew. It means you're an adult Christian ready to die for Jesus, and if you're not, then go back in the car. And he says, I will, I can, I do. And his parents, their eyes got real big like this and said, oh no, what do we get him into? And I found out that boy told everybody for the next 6 months about what confirmation was and how Steve taught him it with a sword. And I think every parish should have a sword. But the fact is that we need to impress our young people. We can't just do business as usual with the young people. If we do, we're going to lose them. We have to impress upon them the reality and the truth of this, even if we have to come at them from a different angle that they're not expecting. And one of the things you're doing is helping to do that. 2 more quick stories. My son Jesse, he's now got 8 kids. Wonderful family, homeschoolers, and they're already starting to choose their colleges they're going to go to. And these kids are good kids, and my son always used teaching moments, and we had a pool. It was above the ground. It was a cheap pool, about 4 feet of water. And my son said to the grandkids, if we go round and around in the pool, we can make a big whirlpool, and the water will go up and splash over on the sides, and it'll go down in the middle, and a big whirlpool. And yeah, right, Dad, we don't believe that. And he said, let's try it. So they get in the pool, and they start going round and around, and after a while, they get this tremendous whirlpool going. And they said, wow, you're right, Dad. And then my son comes up with a lesson. Let's pretend that this current is the world. It's trying to force us to go in the flow. It wants us to accept all its immorality and its atheism and its relativism. And it wants to be against what we believe. So why don't we turn around and go upstream, which is the way I get my title, Swimming Upstream. And they start to go the other way. And it said, if we go the other way, we're going to let the world know that we're not going to let it push us around. We're not going to go with the flow. We're going to be countercultural. We're going to be real Catholics. So they start going the other way. And it's hard. It's very hard because the water's coming at him. And little Sammy says, I can't go anymore. I'm so tired. I got to quit. And Maria Faustina said, swim, Sammy, swim. You don't want to go to hell, Sammy, swim. And so they get going the other way, and they're swimming, and they get it going. And finally, they get it going the other way. And my son said to them, you see here, if all of us together get going against the current of the world, if there's enough of us swimming and pushing the other way, we can turn the culture around. That's what we can do, Catholics. If there's enough of us, and if we vote this way, and if we live this way, and if we teach this way, and we practice our faith and really, really believe it to the point of not being embarrassed of it and being proud out in the culture. I wear this cross everywhere. I don't care if I'm in Jewish areas or Muslim areas or wherever. I want everybody to know what I believe, and it starts conversations every day. I have a goal. I want to talk to 3 people about the Lord and His church every day, one way or another. And if you set your mind to do that and say, God, bring me 3 people a day, you'll be surprised what happens. Be careful before you do that. But I had a lady do that. She said, you know what? My wife had said it this way. You need to put your antennas up and look for the people that God's bringing your way to talk to them every day. Maybe it's at the workplace. Maybe it's at the grocery store. My wife was helping an old lady open the door to the grocery store. She had her arms full. And the lady said, oh, thank you very much. And my wife said, oh, you're welcome. We're Catholics and we love to help people. You don't have to be a convert to do that. We do many nice things for people as Catholics, but we fail to tell why we're doing it. One last story, and I'll close with this. Thinking about when I was giving this talk, but we have to go out and we have to tell people. We have to impress the young people. We have to change the world, and we can't do it with our lips zipped. So I imagine myself standing before God on the end of time when He goes through the book of life and realize that this is true. If you don't think so, read the last couple chapters of the book of Revelation. There is going to be a book, and your name is either going to be in it or not in it. The young people's lives are either going to be in it or not in it. And I imagine myself, I hear my name, Steve Ray. I'm in the waiting room. I come into the court. There's God standing in front of me. And He says, let's see if your name's in the book of life here. There it is, Steve Ray. Come on in. And the door opens on this side, and these wonderful creatures come over, and they start to escort me in, and I hear music, and I smell smells coming out of that room I just can't even imagine. And as I'm going, I hear, Joe Smith. And I say, wait a minute, that's my friend. I sat next to him at the cubicle and worked for the last 30 years. He's the guy that sold me meat at the meat market. He's my neighbor. We had 4th of July together. I want to see what happens with Joe Smith. Just a minute. And Joe Smith comes up, and God says, Joe Smith, let's see if your name's in the book of life. Sorry, Joe, I don't see your name in the book of life. And the angel at the door over here opens, and these evil creatures come out with hooks on their wings, and they grab my friend Joe and start to take him in that door. And Joe sees me going in that door. So Joe shakes loose for a minute. He says, wait a minute, Steve Ray, why are you going in that door and I'm going in this door? I said, Joe, it's because I was a Christian. I was baptized. I recited the creed. I lived in the heart of the Catholic Church. I believed in Jesus Christ as my Savior and my Lord. And he says to me, wait a minute, Steve Ray, you knew all of this and you never told me? I worked with you for 30 years and you never told me and you knew all of this? Well, Joe, I didn't want to be a know-it-all. I know that you had your own way of life, and I didn't want to push my morality down your throat. And I was trying to be ecumenically sensitive. I was trying to be politically correct, Joe. And Joe was angry at me, and he says, the last few words, you knew all of this. What kind of friend are you? And the last words I hear from his mouth are, damn you, Steve Ray. As he goes off to hell and I go off to heaven. And this will happen to us someday. And this is why I think I want to close with this. It's so important what you're doing here. I think that what you're doing is you are helping the young people to survive in a culture that is despising us as Christians, helping them to not conform to this world, but to be true to Jesus Christ and His church, even if it means we suffer. But it's so much easier. You cannot take one log and put it in the fireplace and get it burning. But if you put a whole bunch of logs in the fireplace, you can get a roaring fire. And that's what a Newman Center does. And when it's done right, like you're doing, you get all of them together and you can have a roaring fire. And I say, let the fire burn. Let them burn for Christ. Let them, the light of the fire, show around the rest of the campus and the university. And I'll close with this. I like what you're doing because I'm looking at the pictures out there and the design that you're doing, Father. And it's beautiful. It's Catholic. Too many Catholic structures today are being built like Protestant structures. And what you're building here is not only Catholic, but it's beautiful. And beauty always draws people into the faith. And what you're doing here is magnificent. And I'm proud to be here to help support it and to share about it. And I think that St. Cardinal Newman in heaven is very proud of you all. God bless you and thank you.